The lawyer's words echoed in my head as I stood at the edge of the crystal-clear lake, watching the morning sun paint the water in shades of gold and amber. Miss Chun, you are now the sole owner of 800 acres, including the entire watershed that feeds Riverside Heights. I was 28 years old, and I had just inherited a fortune I never knew existed. My great-uncle Raymond had been a recluse, a quiet man who'd made his money in timber back in the 70s. I'd met him exactly twice in my childhood, once at a family reunion where he'd given me a silver dollar, and once at my grandmother's funeral where he'd squeezed my hand and told me I had kind eyes. When he passed away at 93, I'd expected nothing. Instead, I got everything. The property was breathtaking. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched across rolling hills, and at the heart all sat Lake Raymond. 15 acres of pristine water, fed by natural springs deep in the mountain bedrock. The lake was entirely on my land, surrounded by my trees, filled by springs that bubbled up through my soil. I'd planned to keep it simple. Maybe build a small cabin. Definitely bring my dad up here to fish. It had been his favorite hobby before the accident. That's when I discovered the Riverside Heights Homeowners Association. The subdivision had been built 15 years ago on what used to be farmland adjacent to my great-uncle's property. 200 cookie-cutter houses, each with beige siding and black shutters, each with exactly 0.23 acres, and a mortgage that probably kept the owners up at night. The developer had run a water line from my great-uncle's property to the subdivision, an easement my uncle had granted decades ago in exchange for a hefty annual fee. What the HOA didn't know was that the easement agreement had a clause. It was valid only during my great-uncle's lifetime. Upon his death, the terms would need to be renegotiated with the new property owner. That property owner was me. I didn't plan to cause trouble. I really didn't. I drove up from Seattle with my dad on a sunny Saturday in June, his wheelchair loaded in the back of my truck, along with his fishing gear. Dad had been paralyzed from the waist down 3 years ago when a distracted driver ran a red light. Fishing was one of the few joys he had left, and I'd been counting down the days until I could bring him to this perfect, peaceful lake. We were setting up on the South Shore. Dad's face lit up with the biggest smile I'd seen in months when a golf cart came bouncing down the access road. "Excuse me." A woman's voice cut through the morning like a knife through silk. "This is private property." I turned to see a blonde woman in her 50s, wearing a white visor and a pink polo shirt, driving a golf cart with HOA patrol stenciled on the side. Behind her sat a man with a clipboard and an expression like he'd just bitten into a lemon. "Yes, it is," I said calmly. "It's my private property." The woman, her name tag read Susan Mitchell, HOA president, climbed out of the cart, her tennis shoes crunching on the gravel. "I don't know who you think you are, but this lake services the Riverside Heights community. You can't just come here and—" She stopped, her eyes landing on my father in his wheelchair. Her expression didn't soften, and set up camp. "I'm Emma Chun. I inherited this property from Raymond Chun, and this is my father, Michael. We're fishing." Susan's face went through several shades of red before settling on crimson. "Raymond Chun never let anyone fish here. This lake is part of our community's watershed. It needs to remain pristine for our water supply." I kept my voice level. My great-uncle could do whatever he wanted with his property. So can I. We're not littering. We're not polluting. We're fishing with barbless hooks and catch and release. The man with the clipboard, introduced as Gary, the HOA vice president, stepped forward. "There are rules, Miss Chun. Community standards. This watershed serves 200 families. We can't have random people." "Random people?" My dad's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm sitting in a wheelchair, trying to enjoy a morning with my daughter on her property. What exactly is the problem?" Susan's lips pressed into a thin line. "The problem is that this sets a precedent. If we let you fish here, everyone will want to fish here." "Everyone doesn't own the lake," I said. "I do." Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. The HOA filed a complaint with the county, claiming I was interfering with their water rights. The county investigated and informed them that they had no water rights, only an easement agreement that had expired upon my great-uncle's death. That's when Susan showed up at my Seattle apartment with a contract. We're prepared to offer you $2,000 per year for continued water access, she said, sliding the papers across my kitchen table. That's more than fair. I looked at the document. My great-uncle had been receiving $15,000 per year, with annual increases tied to inflation. The current fair market value would be around $22,000. My uncle was getting $15,000, I said, in 1998. Susan's expression didn't change. That was an excessive amount. $2,000 is the current community rate. The current community rate? I laughed. Susan, you're not in a position to set rates. You need my water. I don't need your money. So what do you want? Gary asked, his arms crossed. I want to bring my disabled father fishing twice a month without being harassed. I want to walk my own property without HOA patrol following me around. I want basic respect. Susan stood up, her chair scraping against my floor. That lake is a community resource. We've been using that water for 15 years. You can't just cut us off. Watch me, I said. The next Saturday, I brought my dad back to the lake. We'd been there less than an hour when 2 police officers showed up, called by the HOA for trespassing. The officers were apologetic after I showed them the property deed. One of them, Officer Martinez, even seemed angry on my behalf. Ma'am, you have every right to be here. I'd suggest you post no trespassing signs around the perimeter. If the HOA continues to harass you, that's something you can press charges for. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Then I called a fencing company. And finally, I called the water district. The fencing went up first, 8-foot chain link around the entire perimeter of the lake and the access road. The HOA sent me a cease and desist letter. My lawyer sent them a response that essentially said, cease and desist from trespassing on my client's property. Then I terminated the water easement. I gave them 60 days' notice, exactly as required by law. The letter was professional and clear. The previous easement agreement had expired. No new agreement had been reached, and therefore water access would be discontinued in 2 months. The HOA went nuclear. They filed for an emergency injunction. They lost. They claimed adverse possession. The judge laughed them out of court. 15 years wasn't nearly long enough, and they'd been paying for access anyway, which negated the claim. They showed up at my door. They called me at work. Susan Mitchell left me a voicemail where she actually cried, saying I was destroying families and ruining lives. I didn't budge. During those 60 days, I brought my dad fishing every single weekend. We watched the leaves change from green to gold. We didn't catch much. Dad said that wasn't the point anyway. The point was the silence, the peace, the feeling of being somewhere beautiful and unspoiled. On the 59th day, Susan called me one last time. Please, she said, and the smugness was gone from her voice, replaced by something that might have been genuine desperation. We have children, elderly people. We need water. You have water, I said. The city main runs right past your subdivision. You'll just have to pay to connect to it. That will cost the HOA over $300,000. The assessments will bankrupt some families. I took a breath. Susan, I offered you a simple compromise. Respect my right to use my own property. Let my disabled father fish in peace. You chose to lawyer up, harass us, and treat us like criminals. You had 60 days to apologize, to negotiate, to act like a reasonable human being. Instead, you doubled down. So that's it? You're really going to do this? I thought about my dad's face the last time we'd been to the lake. How he'd caught a small bass and held it gently before releasing it back into the water. How he'd said it was the best day he'd had since the accident. Yeah, I said, I really am. The water stopped flowing on September 1st. According to the local news, the Riverside Heights HOA held an emergency meeting where they voted to assess each homeowner $7,500 for the city water connection. 3 board members resigned. Susan Mitchell was voted out as president. My lawyer sent me a news article 2 months later. The HOA had filed for bankruptcy after 17 homeowners sued them for mismanagement. I built a small cabin on the lake that winter. Nothing fancy, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a huge deck overlooking the water. My dad and I go up there twice a month. sometimes more. We fish. We talk. Sometimes we just sit in silence and watch the eagles hunt. Last week, I got a letter from the new HOA president. It was handwritten, not typed. It was an apology, a real one. They asked if we could negotiate a new easement agreement. They offered $30,000 per year and a clause that guaranteed my family's right to use the property however we wanted, whenever we wanted. I'm considering it, but I haven't decided yet, because some lessons are worth $300,000 to teach. And some Saturday mornings with your dad, watching the sun rise over a lake that's entirely, completely legally yours, those are priceless.